Attica in 1971. The psychology behind America's deadliest prison riot. On a cold September morning in 1971, a single door slammed inside Attica Correctional Facility, and that sound became the spark that ignited the deadliest prison uprising in American history. Within hours, 1,300 men stood united, not with weapons, but with something far more dangerous inside a prison, a shared belief that they had nothing left to lose. What happened next wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It was psychological combustion, a collision of fear, desperation, and a breaking point decades in the making. Attica didn't explode because inmates suddenly turned violent. It exploded because human beings, stripped of dignity, cut off from hope, and denied a voice, reached the limit of what the mind can absorb. And the most shocking part? When the dust settled after 5 brutal days, 43 people were dead, and yet the question still hangs in the air half a century later. What truly pushes a confined population from silent suffering to organized rebellion? And why did Attica become the point where the system finally snapped? Today, we're not just revisiting the riot, we're dissecting the psychology that made it inevitable. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Before Attica became a national wound, it was a warning no one wanted to hear. For years, reports quietly circulated about overcrowded cell blocks, restricted family visits, racial tensions, and living conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. But in 1971, the country was already drowning in crises: Vietnam protests, political distrust, and a justice system being questioned at every level. Attica was just another file in the stack. Until it wasn't. Inside those walls lived men from every background, some hardened, some hopeful, many simply trying to survive their sentences. But despite their differences, they shared one thing: the overwhelming sense that the system saw them as bodies to be controlled, not minds to be understood. Food portions were small, medical care inconsistent, and opportunities for rehabilitation were nearly non-existent. Yet what truly set the stage for the uprising wasn't just what the inmates experienced, it was what they felt. A rising pressure, a mental tightening, a belief that the outside world had forgotten them entirely. Psychologists call it the threshold moment, the point at which a person no longer fears consequences because the consequences have already been lived, day after day. In Attica, that feeling didn't spread slowly. It moved like electricity. By the time September arrived, the prison wasn't a powder keg. It was a fuse already burning. And once the spark hit, the reaction would be unlike anything America had ever seen inside a correctional facility. The Attica uprising begins. It started with a routine movement, the kind of everyday transition that happens inside every prison across America. A gate jammed. Officers shouted orders. Confusion spread through a hallway already crowded with men heading to the yard. But at Attica, that tiny disruption hit a population simmering just below boiling. Inmates had spent months whispering about change, frustration, and neglect. The air was thick with conversations officers couldn't quite piece together. Some men wanted reform. Others wanted recognition. All of them wanted to be treated as human beings. So when the gate malfunctioned and tensions escalated, the moment didn't feel accidental, it felt inevitable. One push, one shout, one inmate refusing to retreat. That's all it took. Chaos didn't erupt instantly, it unfolded with a strange sense of purpose. Men moved through the block, seizing control of areas faster than staff could respond. Officers retreated for safety, unaware that this wasn't just a disturbance. It was the beginning of a takeover that would draw the eyes of the entire nation. Within hours, more than half the prison was in inmate hands. But what shocked the outside world wasn't the numbers, it was the organization. Prisoners quickly created leadership groups, medical stations, and communication lines. They gathered hostages but handled them with caution, knowing their safety would be crucial in any negotiation. From the watchtowers, the state saw a riot. Inside the yard, the inmates believed they were building a revolution. Attica was no longer just a prison. It had become a battlefield of ideas. Dignity versus authority, survival versus structure, voice versus silence. And for the first time in decades, the men inside believed they might finally be heard. Prison conditions before the riot. To understand why Attica erupted, you must understand what life felt like behind those walls long before the first shout was ever heard. Because the uprising didn't begin in 1971, it began years earlier, in the quiet suffering no camera ever captured. Attica was built to hold discipline, but it ended up holding pressure. Overcrowded cell blocks forced men into spaces so small they could stretch their arms and touch both walls. Many spent 14 to 16 hours a day locked inside those cells, with limited access to showers, recreation, or educational programs. But physical discomfort wasn't the real breaking point. Psychologically, inmates felt stripped of identity. Letters from loved ones were heavily censored or sometimes withheld. Visits were rare and tightly controlled. Basic needs, medical attention, proper food portions, even access to books, depended on a system slow to respond and quicker to deny. Men from different backgrounds were often housed together without any meaningful effort to manage racial tension. In an era charged with national conflict, Attica mirrored the world outside. Except inside, everyone's frustrations were compressed into concrete. Yet the most powerful trigger wasn't what the inmates were denied. It was what they were told about themselves. Day after day, through harsh rules, rigid routines, and limited communication, the message was constant. You don't matter. Psychologists warn that when people lose agency, they don't just get angry. They disconnect from consequences. That emotional distance becomes a psychological vacuum, where even risky actions start to feel like the only remaining option. By the summer of 1971, the inmates had compiled a list of 27 demands. Not wild demands. Not extremist requests. Just basic rights: better food, fair treatment, improved medical care, opportunities for education, and respect regardless of race. But their petitions went unanswered. Silence can be louder than force. And in Attica, silence fed the belief that peaceful change was impossible. So when the spark came in September, the uprising didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like the last available language. Psychology of collective action. When 1,300 men rose together at Attica, it wasn't because they suddenly became unified overnight. It was because they reached the same psychological destination, even if they took different paths to get there. Collective action inside a prison isn't simple. It requires trust in a place built on suspicion. It requires cooperation among people with different backgrounds, beliefs, and survival strategies. And most surprisingly, it requires restraint. Psychologists call this phenomenon shared deprivation. When individuals experience the same frustration for long enough, their minds start seeking connection, even with people they would normally avoid. Experiences that once felt personal begin to feel universal. In Attica, this shift happened quietly, almost invisibly, in the years before the riot. But once the uprising began, the psychological transformation became impossible to ignore. Men who never spoke suddenly stood side by side. Rival groups set aside tensions. People who spent years in silence found themselves chanting together for basic dignity. This wasn't random unity, it was survival-driven psychology. Inside the prison yard, inmate leaders emerged, not through intimidation, but through credibility. The men listened to those who had spoken up before, those who had tried to negotiate, those who understood the power of staying organized rather than chaotic. There were rules. There were boundaries. There were makeshift committees dedicated to medical care, security, and negotiations. In one of the most unexpected developments, some inmates even worked to protect the hostages, keeping them calm, providing water, and insisting that no harm come to them. They knew that violence against the hostages would destroy any chance of being taken seriously. The uprising became a psychological ecosystem of its own. Fear pushed men together. Hope kept them focused. And shared suffering gave them a collective identity stronger than any individual grievance. For 5 days, Attica wasn't just a prison under inmate control. It was a living study in how the human mind behaves when pushed beyond its limits, and then given a sudden chance to reclaim power. But unity, no matter how strong, can only survive as long as both sides are willing to communicate. And soon, the eyes of the nation would turn to Attica as negotiations began. The negotiations. When the smoke of the initial takeover cleared, something unprecedented happened inside the walls of Attica. The inmates didn't demand destruction, they demanded dialogue. For the first time in American prison history, a rebellion of this scale opened with a list of clear, structured requests. Not escape routes. Not revenge. But human needs, better medical care, religious freedom, fair disciplinary practices, access to education, improved living conditions, and amnesty for actions taken during the uprising. Outside the prison gates, New York officials struggled to understand the moment. Was this a riot? A political statement? A humanitarian crisis? Inside the yard, inmates were already organizing a negotiating team, choosing representatives trusted across racial groups. They invited observers, community leaders, journalists, lawyers, hoping a neutral presence might ensure fairness. For a brief moment, it worked. Observers entered Attica and were struck not by chaos, but by structure. Hostages were frightened but unharmed. Committees worked from makeshift tables. Men who had spent years in silence spoke with clarity and determination about the conditions they lived under. This shocked the country. It contradicted decades of assumptions about incarcerated people, that they were unpredictable, unmanageable, incapable of collective thought. Attica showed a different reality. When people are denied a voice, they don't lose the ability to speak, they lose the opportunity. But the negotiations soon became strained. State officials hesitated to grant amnesty. They worried that any concession might encourage similar uprisings elsewhere. Pressure from law enforcement groups intensified. The governor, watching closely, faced political consequences no matter which direction he moved. Inside the yard, hope began to thin. Every hour without progress felt like another hour closer to disaster. Inmate leaders tried to hold the group together, reminding them that negotiation was still possible. But fear crept in, fear that time was running out, fear that the state was preparing a violent retaking, fear that the fragile unity could collapse under stress. By the fourth day, both sides felt cornered. The inmates felt unheard. The state felt challenged. And the window for peaceful resolution narrowed to a sliver. Attica was now standing on the edge of a decision that would define it forever. The violent retaking. September 13, 1971, began like any other day inside the prison yard, tense, uncertain, and heavy with anticipation. But outside, the state had made its decision. Attica would not end on terms set by the inmates. The negotiation window was closing, and the authorities prepared a retaking that would shock the nation. The assault was swift and overwhelming. State police stormed the prison with rifles, shotguns, and tear gas, advancing through corridors where the men had hoped dialogue would prevail. The psychology of the moment shifted instantly. Fear replaced hope, and chaos replaced order. Inmates fought to protect themselves and the hostages, but the disparity in firepower was catastrophic. In just hours, 43 lives were lost, including both inmates and correctional officers. Hundreds more were injured. The violence wasn't just physical, it left psychological scars that would last a lifetime. Survivors recounted the terror, hearing friends fall, witnessing unspeakable injuries, and feeling the fragile sense of control slip away in an instant. Yet even in the violence, certain behaviors reflected the same collective psychology that had emerged during the uprising. Some inmates shielded hostages, negotiated ceasefires in isolated areas, and tried to maintain a thread of humanity amid the storm. Others, traumatized and enraged, reacted instinctively, a natural response to the overwhelming threat. For the outside world, the media coverage painted Attica as a violent failure, a prison riot that had to be crushed. But beneath the headlines was a deeper story, the human cost of ignoring systemic neglect, and the terrifying power of a population pushed to the edge. Attica became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that punishment without reform, control without empathy, and confinement without dignity can ignite even the most rigid institutions. And yet, the questions lingered. What had gone wrong before the violence? Could it have been prevented? And how does a society reconcile with the trauma left behind? Legacy and reform. In the aftermath of Attica, the nation was left grappling with both grief and outrage. Public opinion was divided. Some blamed the inmates, others blamed the authorities, and many couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth. The conditions that sparked the riot had been known for years. The Attica uprising forced a reckoning. Investigations revealed overcrowding, inadequate medical care, racial discrimination, and a lack of meaningful rehabilitation programs. The report didn't just indict a prison, it highlighted a system that prioritized punishment over humanity. Psychologically, the riot became a case study in human behavior under extreme oppression. Experts emphasized that the violence wasn't inevitable, but predictable. When dignity, agency, and fairness are stripped away, even orderly institutions can erupt. Attica taught that control without respect breeds rebellion, and neglect without oversight can have deadly consequences. Reforms were slow, but they began to take shape. Prisons across the country examined policies on inmate rights, medical care, and grievance procedures. The Attica Commission report became a blueprint for change, emphasizing rehabilitation and dialogue over mere confinement. Yet Attica's legacy extends beyond policy. It entered the cultural consciousness as a symbol of resistance and a reminder of the importance of empathy in systems built to manage human behavior. For the survivors, the trauma endured shaped the rest of their lives. Families, officials, and society at large were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, injustice, and the human need for dignity. Even today, when discussions arise about prison reform, solitary confinement, or inmates' rights, the shadow of Attica looms large. The riot serves as both a warning and a lesson that every individual's mental and emotional state matters, and that systems ignoring those realities do so at their own peril. Reflection and call to action. Attica was more than a prison riot. It was a window into the human psyche, a stark illustration of what happens when people are systematically stripped of dignity, ignored, and pushed to the brink. The lessons are clear even decades later. Neglect and dehumanization have consequences far beyond the walls of any prison. Collective action, unity under pressure, and the pursuit of justice are as much about the mind as they are about circumstance. Attica reminds us that change is never born from silence. It is born from voices demanding to be heard. As we reflect on the events of 1971, one question remains. How do we prevent history from repeating itself? The answer lies not just in law or policy, but in empathy, understanding, and the recognition of shared humanity, even behind bars. If this story gave you a new perspective on the human mind under extreme pressure, on justice, and on history's lessons, make sure to subscribe and join us. We explore the pivotal moments in criminal justice, the psychology of rebellion, and the untold stories that continue to shape our world. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the events that changed history forever. Because understanding the past is the first step to creating a fairer future.